Bonjour, how are you? I am so happy to see you.
Oh, you have such a great energy. I love it. How vibrant.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just very happy to be interviewed from France.
Ah,
I just love France.
I know
Yes,
you're
so
coming
it's
back
always
in.
wonderful.
I know you're coming to Marseille on the 9th and 10th of March,
March.
2013, to Sonia's S17 Productions big event there. So you're loved in France.
Well, and I love France. Oh my goodness, that was one of the first international publishers that picked up my book in 1976. And oh, it was just wonderful. Yeah.
I want to remind everybody that in 1975, you coined the term near death experience. You're like this person that made near death experience known. You wrote a best selling book that sold millions of copies called Life After Life. This is extraordinary to have done that at such an early stage because now everybody speaks about this. I've been doing lots of interviews on near death experiences. Of course, I had to interview you. Of course, I had to.
Yeah. Well, and I must say also that although I was the person who brought it into knowledge in in last century, um, my inspiration from this came from Plato.
Mm.
Plato and the early Greek philosophers were fascinated by this subject, and the near-death experience actually was one of the first topics that these early Greek philosophers studied, and they had the same sort of debate that we have today. Plato heard these stories and he took them at face value and thought they were life after death. Meanwhile, his contemporary Democritus, who was the founder of the atomic theory of matter, looked at these same things and he says, no, it's not life after death. It's just the brain as
Mm-hmm.
the body goes down and so on. So this is a very, it was one of the most important questions in early Greek philosophy. And that was my initial introduction to it because I'm a great lover of the ancient Greeks.
Mm-hmm. But as you were practicing psychology and all of it, you must have run also into some cases, or was it really studying those books that started making you wanting to know more?
Well, actually, first heard of it in Plato in
Okay.
1962 when I was reading the Republic. But 3 years later, in 1965, when I was an undergraduate student in philosophy at the University of Virginia, I met Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry at the university, and he had had such an experience some years before when he was pronounced dead. And then when I became a philosophy professor, I began to hear these stories from my students and from the faculty members at this university. So by the time I went to medical school in 1972, I had already been investigating these things for about 10 years. So my initial interest was philosophy, was the philosophical context. But yes, then as a medical doctor, I heard many of these stories from patients.
Mm-hmm. Was it was it also out of body experiences or only at the time NDEs?
Oh yes, the out of body experience is a common component of these near death experiences because very often the first thing people say is that at this point where their heart stopped beating, that they suddenly found themselves up above looking down at their own bodies from above. So an out of body experience is part of the near death experience.
Mm-hmm. But more and more people now report that they can create a out of body experience without going through an NDE. It's something that we can ignite.
Oh, absolutely. And this has always been true also, even from the ancient times. And there, one doesn't have to be near death to have a near death, to have an out of body experience. And there are other situations as well which can bring about an out of body experience, including astronomers looking through their telescopes often report this experience of leaving their bodies. And a very wonderful concert pianist and also psychologist, well-known psychologist in Paris, Eric Pagani, told me in 1988 that when he was performing a concert, he suddenly found himself out of his body, looking down at himself at playing the piece, and surrounded by this light. And when he came back to his body, the piece was over. And I asked Eric, I said, well, did the people seem to like the music? And Eric is very modest, and he said, oh, yes, they seem to. However, fortunately, his girlfriend was there at the concert, and she said to me, as a matter of fact, the people were yelling and screaming and applauding because of how profound the music was. So Eric, when he realized that this had happened to him, he thought, well, then it must happen to other people as well. So he interviewed his fellow performers of classical music and found many others who had out-of-body experiences during their performances on stage. And he wrote a book about it in France, which is called, I think, Music and Spirituality or something. Very wonderful book.
This is so exciting. Do they actually have a similar experience of there is no more time, total awareness, being able to go from feeling what other people are feeling? Is it also things that people in this creative mode perceive and feel also?
Yes, I think that there are other parts of these spiritual experiences, of the near-death experiences, also are brought about by other occasions, such as, mystical experiences and so on, which may not be connected with a close call with death. However, in these near-death experiences, there are features which are very rare apart from the near-death experience, and that would include, for example, the experience some people report to us of seeing their entire life reviewed around them in a panoramic, three-dimensional, holographic vision in which they see everything they've ever done, but they say that because language is sequential, they have to relate this as though it were a sequence. But they say in the experiencing of it, it is not sequential, that everything is there at once, and they see everything they've ever done in a vision instantaneously.
We're learning through those near-death experiences that there is only the now.
Exactly, that's right. That time is an illusion, which is, I think, something that many philosophers figured out a long time ago just by reasoning it out. But the notion of time that we use in ordinary language is really nonsensical in the ultimate way. It's so ingrained in our ordinary language that we think with it, and it seems to us common sense. But in reality, as soon as you start thinking of time, you quickly get into things that don't make sense.
You got interested in past regressions as well, from my understanding?
A little bit, and I must say that basically I'm a very boring person, because all of the interests from which I am known originated with the ancient Greeks. And Plato too was fascinated by reincarnation and believed in reincarnation. And the first person who introduced this notion into the West was Pythagoras, who claimed to remember 8 of his past lives.
My goodness.
So that was, again, my introduction to this. I was not a religious person, and still am not. I never went to church as a child or any of these things. I was interested in astronomy from a very early age. And so the first contact with the notion of an afterlife that I had was literally in college. Then I began to read about this in the books of Plato. And so the idea of an afterlife has always been very counterintuitive to me. I think unless you're exposed to this idea as a child, which I was not, it's very difficult, I think, to come to terms with this. So to me, it's been a long period of my life where I just didn't know. But I must say, in all honesty, that in about 3 years ago, um, I finally reached the point where if I look at all that I have learned over the years, um, it seems to me really the most intellectually honest and straightforward thing to say is that there does seem to be life after death. And that to me to this day is very astonishing. It took me a long time really to come to terms with this.
I just came back from Glasgow, and it was Dr. Weiss. You probably have heard
Yeah.
of him. He was there, and it's very
Yeah.
impressive the work that he has done with that.
Yes.
He has also came to the same conclusion despite his scientific mind that said no, it's not possible.
Really. I think that recently I've written a book a couple of years ago talking about what I call shared death experiences.
Yes.
And this is something that has not been very well publicized yet. But in fact, we know that all of the features or components of these near-death experiences also occur quite often to bystanders at the death of someone else. That is, as the person in the bed dies, the people standing around frequently have these experiences too of leaving their bodies and accompanying their dying loved ones partway to this light and so on. And this really makes it very difficult to support the idea that these near-death experiences come from the cutoff of the oxygen flow to the brain. Because if that's true, then why are the bystanders who are not ill or injured? There's no question that blood is cut off to their brains, and yet they have identically these same experiences. So I think that we have something here that is just very difficult to understand in ordinary terms.
And our logic needs really to catch up. You were saying in another interviews I've saw or read that you're saying a whole new system of logic is needed here
Yes,
now.
yes, absolutely. And I think that the great thinker David Hume, who lived from 1711 to 1776, Hume was kind of the original skeptic, or the original Western skeptic in a way. And he said absolutely that a rational proof of life after death is not possible due to the limitations of logic. And I think Hume was exactly right. Aristotelian logic does not accommodate the possibility of life after death. However, I do think that new systems of logic enable us to think rationally about this question of life after death. I am absolutely convinced of it, and I'm willing to defend that idea.
Beautiful. You must have, throughout all this experience, those books and everything, people must have seen you at some point as a savior, as some kind of God emerging on
I
Earth. I
know,
mean, what has
I
this been
know.
like?
It is, and it's very embarrassing because I don't look very good in a turban and a robe. So I'm not a very good guru because the easiest thing for me to say is I don't know. I am a logician, and to me, I feel very strongly that I am almost completely ignorant. And I think that that is our lot as human beings, that we know very little compared to what there is to be known. And so I was very uncomfortable when people look to me for the answers. I just have to say people have to decide this for themselves, I
Because what
think.
happened, remind us what happened, because this book, Life After Life, was just huge success. And then right after that, you wrote another one to kind of justify, because you were scared that people, and I guess this is also something that we need to speak of in this interview, about the fact that a lot of people then want to have those near-death experiences, or people even feel like, why then bother being on Earth if there is such a feeling of total love and of feeling so
Oh,
great?
yes. Yes. Well, that has been raised as an abstract possibility that people might read this and decide to commit suicide. Excuse me. But in reality, the studies have shown quite differently that reading about these near-death experiences tends to diminish suicidal ideation. For example, these reports have been used to help people who have suicidal thoughts, and apparently, reading accounts of near-death experiences makes suicidal people makes their suicidal thoughts diminish.
Mm-hmm.
Also, we've interviewed many people who had their near-death experience as a result of a suicide attempt. And what they tell us is that never again would they attempt suicide because they learned from their near-death experience that even when times are difficult, that that life has a purpose.
Mm. And there are some bad near-death experiences too.
Well, there are. However, they're very difficult to study because they're infrequent. It's much easier, obviously, to study a big number than it is to study a small number. But what we do have those cases where people report hellish or unpleasant things. And another difficulty in studying the negative experiences is that they're a lot more variegated. That is, that they differ from one another very much. The positive ones seem to have a similar structure, whereas the negative ones are divided into several different groups, 3 different groups. And I forget the first 2, but the smallest subgroup are those in which people see hellish imagery and so on. So it's just very difficult to make an assessment of these when we have relatively few of them.
Mm-hmm.
Another complicating factor is that in the United States, unlike in France, we have, as you know, many people who are fundamentalist Christians who want the rest of us to go to hell because we don't subscribe to their ideology. So apparently in the United States, this religious fanatic wrote a book which was manufactured. It was apparently a fabrication in which he claimed that there were all of these hellish near-death experiences. But then when another physician got in touch with him who wanted to know about this man began to backtrack, and he said, well, I didn't actually talk to all of them. I saw some of them on television. And then he was quoted in another book as saying that you have to scare people in order to convert them. So apparently this one man who was a religious fanatic wrote this book in an attempt to scare people. And that has gotten out into the public arena now, and people think it seriously, but apparently the book was mostly a fabrication. So I think that yes, these negative experiences do occur, but that it's just very difficult to study them. So I don't know. And also there is the fact that we might well imagine that people who have a negative experience are less likely to report it. Frankly, for me, I think it would be very embarrassing to say to the doctor, doctor, when I died, I went to hell. People might be less likely to report such things. So
there's thousands and thousands and thousands of testimonial now on NDE.
Yes, indeed. We have no lack of testimonials, and these experiences are common all over the world. The question that's more pressing in a way is not gathering further cases, but coming up with some rational system to understand what they mean. I think that's the real question.
Well, yeah, what do you think it will take? Because right now we're seeing many topics come to the big medias and being talked about, and some people have been, I'm thinking right now just in France yesterday, that some people have been doing experiences for 2 years on rats, and how the Monsanto seeds have been really making those little rats so many tumors and infecting them. And so all these things are a lot, it seems like a lot of hidden underground work has been done, and now suddenly it's on the eyes of every person on the planet. And what do you think, what is NDE's role, and how will it play in this whole kind of awakening, or at least starting to see a little bit more reality as it is, instead of seeing it through the eyes of just something that we've been taught, but not as it is really? You know, what would it
Well,
take to take it to this next level?
I don't know. And I really don't know. And at the same time, I do have a certain conjecture or idea. And let me say this from the very beginning. I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that I'm wrong. But I look at the world situation now, and I am not optimistic. I am not optimistic about what I see in the world. I know today in France you're worried and the embassies are closing and so on. And this is all over the world. And we have so many things now, including nuclear terrorism and the the changes in the atmosphere, the global warming. Certainly not in France, but in the United States, the collapse of our civilization due to the immediate gratification mentality. Americans don't want to put any effort into things anymore. They don't want to think through a case. They want other people to tell them the instant answers. And, to me, the world situation is just very grave. Mm-hmm. And in that context, I think in that kind of situation, people have always turned to the spiritual life for comfort and consolation. And I suspect, yes, that we will see an upsurge or an increase of interest in these near-death experiences due to the calamitous world situation that we're in now.
More and more cancers, more and more diseases. Yeah.
Yes.
So what happens when we die? Let's see what you would answer to that big question.
Well, the people that I've talked with have seen the initial stages, I think. They talk about leaving their bodies and going through a passageway into a light and seeing their deceased relatives greet them and seeing a review of their lives. But the question is, what comes next after that? And I think that probably in the world that we live in and in the minds in which we are embedded in this life and our bodies, I think it's probably impossible for us to even imagine. And that's what people with near-death experiences tell me, that no matter how eloquent and articulate they may be, no matter how well educated they are, no matter how many languages they speak, no matter where they are from the world, they tell me the same thing all over the world. They say, I just can't describe it. That the words that we have in this life are not adequate to describe this experience. So I think that we can get inspiration and comfort from these people with near-death experiences. And I think as a personal being, not trying to convince anyone else, but just to say where my opinion is, I do believe, or I think, that there is life after death. And at the same time, I think that we're going to have to wait until we get over there to see exactly what it's like, because I don't think it's describable from the kind of mentality that we have while we're on the earth.
And there's beautiful life lesson in them for sure that we can live right now and learn and appreciate, and not fear that someday maybe everything is gone and stops. Far from it.
Yes, and also that people all over the world tell me that whatever they had been chasing, and as a psychiatrist, my opinion is that almost everybody is chasing something. Some people are chasing power, which is so ridiculous. I myself have spent my life chasing knowledge. Some people chase fame or money or any of these other things. But whatever they were chasing up to this near-death experience, they come back and they say the same thing from all over the world. They say, what this life is all about is learning how to love, because that's what everybody saw. But when they saw this review of their life, that the most important things in this review had to do with the love that they had shown other people. And I think that's really the most important message of these experiences.
So do you think God is love, love is everywhere, and we are love, and this is what it's all about, huh?
I really do. And the way I've come to think of this world that we're in, I think that this is God's education and entertainment medium. And I say entertainment not lightly, but
Yeah.
you know, life does have a dramatic structure in a way. I think that we can live a comic life or a tragic life, but that nonetheless, it is, I think that we're here to have these experiences to learn. And there is a certain fascination with it. I mean, the older I get, I'm 68 years old now, and life is just so utterly fascinating. And I've heard many people my age talk about this, how the older you get, the more pronounced the tendency is that when you look back on your life, you see that it has a sort of dramatic structure that, you know, that we had a mythologist in the United States some years ago. His name was Joseph Campbell. He's a
Yes.
very great scholar of mythology. And I heard Joe Campbell say one time that I think he was then in his 80s, and he said that as he looked back at his life, he had the uncanny feeling that it had been a script almost, or a play or a drama. And I was a geriatric psychiatrist for a while, dealing with the elderly. And this was something I heard all the time from my elderly patients, that the older you get, the more you feel like that your life was somehow like a script or a drama. Now, whether that is something to do with reality, or I suppose another way of looking at that is that it might be that the great dramatists, Sophocles and Aeschylus and Euripides, had themselves noticed that feature of life and were able to put that on the stage as a drama. So, you know, there's two ways of looking at it, but nonetheless, the effect, I think, is very real.
Well, that gives us a lot of food for thoughts. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Moody,
you.
for being so
Thank you.
vibrant.
Oh my goodness. And I've got to say, you must talk with Eben Alexander III. Do you know of his case?
No.
Oh my goodness. Look this up on the internet. His name
Okay.
is Eben, Eben, Alexander III. He was a professor of neurosurgery at Harvard for 15 years.
Wow.
And a complete epiphenomenalist. He thought that the consciousness is just the chemistry of the brain and so on. In November of 2008, he developed E. coli meningitis, which is virtually unsurvivable in adults. When they do survive, it's usually they are impaired, you know, unable. But Eben went into a coma for a week. When he came out of it, not only did he survive, he's better than ever, and he had the most profound near-death experience I've ever heard, in which he kept seeing this young woman who he didn't know who she was, but she was there. To make a very long story short, when he came back and he recovered from this illness, he inquired into his family background. He had known he had been adopted. But after this, he looked up his birth family. He found that his birth parents had gotten married after he was born, had other children, and they were in mourning about the loss of their daughter. when he saw the picture of their daughter, it was the woman
Oh
he
my
had
God, I've
seen.
got shivers.
I know. It's the most amazing story, and he's a delightful person. You really should interview him.
Done. Done.
Hey,
So we're excited to see you on the 9th and 10th of March in
yeah,
Marseille.
yeah,
And I'll post the links of those for people that want to come and see you there, as well as a lot of other specialists and experts on this topic and testimonials. And I read also you're on the 13th of March in Bruxelles, in Belgium. Huh?
yes, yes. And I
Good.
am so looking forward to being back in France with the wonderful French people, and also, I must say, with the wonderful food.
Ah, yes. C'est bon, la
Oh,
vie. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Raymond.
my.
Hmm. But as you were practicing psychology and all of it, you must have run also into some cases, or was it really studying those books that started making you wanting to know more?
Well, actually, first heard of it in Plato in
Okay.
1962 when I was reading the Republic. But 3 years later, in 1965, when I was an undergraduate student in philosophy at the University of Virginia, I met Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry at the university, and he had had such an experience some years before when he was pronounced dead. And then when I became a philosophy professor,
Back
always
in,
wonderful.
I know you're coming to Marseille on the 9th and 10th of
March.
March 2013 to Sonia's S17 Productions big event there. So you're loved in France.
Well, and I love France. Oh my goodness, that was one of the first international publishers that picked up my book in 1976. And oh, it was just wonderful. Yeah.
19, I want to remind everybody that in 1975, you coined the term near death experience. You're like this person that made near death experience known. You wrote a best selling book that sold millions of copies called Life After Life. This is extraordinary to have done that at such a such an early stage, because now everybody speaks about this. I've been doing lots of interviews on near-death experiences. Of course, I had to interview you. Of course, I had to.
Yeah. Well, and I must say also that although I was the person who brought it into knowledge in last century, um, my inspiration from this came from Plato.
Mm.
Plato and the early Greek philosophers were fascinated by this subject. And the near-death experience actually was one of the first topics that these early Greek philosophers studied. And they had the same sort of debate that we have today. Plato heard these stories and he took them at face value and thought they were life after death. Meanwhile, his contemporary Democritus, who was the founder of the atomic theory of matter, looked at these same things and he says, no, it's not life after death. It's just the brain as
Mm-hmm.
the body goes down and so on. So this is a very, it was one of the most important questions in early Greek philosophy. And that was my initial introduction to it because I'm a great lover of the ancient Greeks.
Hello, Dr. Moody.
Bonjour, how are you? I am so happy to see you.
Oh, you have such a great energy. I love it. How vibrant.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just very happy to be interviewed from France.
Oh,
I just love France.
I know
Yes,
you're
so
coming back.